By 1944, 17 million pieces of undelivered mail were choking warehouses in England, cutting American soldiers off from home. The Army gave 855 black women 6 months to clear it. They did it in 3, then went largely unrecognized for 70 years. To understand what these women did, you first have to understand what mail meant to a soldier in that war. There were no phone calls home, no messages, no way to hear a loved one's voice across an ocean. A letter was everything. It was the only thread connecting a frightened young man in a foxhole to his mother, his wife, his children. A letter told him he was still remembered. It told him what he was fighting to get back to. Commanders understood that mail was not a luxury. It was a weapon, as vital to morale as bullets were to battle. And by 1944, that lifeline had broken down completely. The sheer scale of the American Army in Europe, constantly moving, constantly growing into the millions, had overwhelmed the postal system entirely. Mail poured into warehouses and airplane hangars in England faster than anyone could sort it, and there it sat. Millions upon millions of letters and packages addressed to men who had moved or whose units had changed or whose names were shared by dozens of others. Whole buildings filled up, floor to ceiling, with mail that no one had the time or the system to deliver. Soldiers wrote home begging for word, not knowing that the word was already there, waiting, lost somewhere in a mountain of paper no one could climb. Families back home grew frantic, sending letter after letter into what felt like a void, hearing nothing back. The backlog was not just an administrative headache. It was a slow wound to the morale of the entire army in Europe, and the generals knew it. They needed someone to fix it, and every attempt so far had failed. The problem was simply too big. So who does an army turn to when it faces a job so big that it seems impossible? In this case, it did not turn to the units it trusted most. It turned, almost reluctantly, to a group of soldiers it had spent the entire war trying to keep on the sideline. This was a segregated army, and it was also an army that was deeply uneasy about women in uniform at all. Black women who had joined the Women's Army Corps to serve their country found themselves boxed in on 2 sides at once, kept back, both because of their race and because of their sex. For most of the war, they were denied the chance to serve overseas entirely, no matter how qualified they were, while white women in the same corps were sent abroad. That began to change only because of relentless pressure. Prominent black leaders, among them the great educator Mary McLeod Bethune, pushed hard for black women to be given a real role in the war abroad, arguing that they had earned the right to serve their country wherever the fight took them. They found an ally in the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, who used her influence to press the case. Out of that pressure came a decision to send a battalion of black women overseas at last. And the job chosen for them was the one no one else had been able to solve: the mail. 855 women were gathered from across the country, trained, and formed into a unit with a long official name, the 6888 Central Postal Directory Battalion. On paper, it was a chance. In reality, more than a few officers handed them the impossible backlog, fully expecting them to fail, which would have proved, in the eyes of the doubters, that black women had no business overseas in the first place. The women knew it. They understood they were being set up to fall, and they were determined to do the opposite. But those officers had not counted on the woman who would be leading them, because the commander of the 6888 was not the kind of person who let anyone tell her what her soldiers could not do. Her name was Charity Adams. She was the daughter of a minister from South Carolina, college educated, sharp, and utterly unwilling to accept the limits the world tried to place on her. She had been among the very first group of black women, commissioned as officers in the Women's Army Corps, and by the end of the war, she would rise to become the highest-ranking black woman in the entire United States Army. Adams held her soldiers to a fierce standard because she understood exactly what they were up against. She knew that her battalion would be watched by people who wanted them to fail, and that any mistake would be blamed not on the impossible conditions, but on the women themselves and on their race. So she demanded excellence, and she defended her women like a lioness. That combination, high standards inside the unit and an iron refusal to be pushed around from outside it, would define everything the 688 accomplished. In February of 1945, the battalion shipped out for Europe, crossing an ocean that was still a battlefield of its own. And what waited for them on the other side was worse than anything they had imagined. They sailed from the United States on a fast ocean liner, the Île-de-France, in the winter of 1945. The crossing was dangerous. German submarines still prowled the Atlantic, and the ship had to make sudden evasive turns to avoid the threat of torpedoes. But they reached Scotland safely, and from there they were sent by train down to the English city of Birmingham, where the mountain of mail was waiting for them. When they finally saw the task in front of them, it was staggering. Warehouses filled floor to ceiling with letters and parcels, 17 million pieces of mail packed into cold, dark buildings, some of the letters more than 2 years old. The Army had told them they had 6 months to clear it. Looking at the sheer size of it, 6 months seemed impossibly optimistic, and the conditions they were handed to do this work in were a fresh insult all their own, because the Army that needed them so badly still could not bring itself to treat them decently. The buildings they worked in were unheated, and they had arrived in the cold and damp of an English winter. The women sorted mail in coats and gloves, their breath visible in the freezing air, in warehouses so poorly lit they could barely see. Rats had gotten into the packages, gnawing through boxes and letters drawn by the food inside. Care packages sent from home had spoiled long ago, and the spoiled food had turned to mold, smearing and destroying the addresses on everything around it. The stench in some of those buildings was overpowering, and even the addresses that survived were a nightmare to solve. There were thousands of soldiers who shared the exact same name. By some counts, there were 7,500 men in the Army named Robert Smith alone. A letter addressed simply to Private Robert Smith could belong to any one of thousands of men scattered across a continent. Soldiers were wounded and moved to hospitals. Units were transferred overnight. Men were killed or captured or sent home. A single misdirected letter could mean a soldier never heard from his family again, or that a family never learned what had become of their son. So the women of the 688 built their own system to conquer it. They created a vast set of locator cards, millions of them, tracking individual soldiers by their serial numbers, updating the cards as units moved, cross-referencing names and nicknames and half-legible scrawls and the countless duplicate names. They became detectives, puzzling out where a letter was truly meant to go from the thinnest of clues. They organized themselves into 3 shifts and ran the operation around the clock, day and night, 7 days a week, processing tens of thousands of pieces of mail with every shift. They turned chaos into a machine, and they ran it better than anyone had believed possible. Everywhere they went, segregation followed. The women of the 688 lived, ate, and slept apart from the white soldiers, given separate and inferior facilities. When some in the military tried to arrange a segregated social club just for them, Charity Adams refused it. And when a general grew impatient with the operation and announced that he was going to send a white officer to show these women how to run things properly, Adams gave an answer that became legend. "Over my dead body, sir," she told him. She would not have her competence or her soldiers' competence insulted by the assumption that they needed a white man to do their job for them. The confrontations did not stop there. At one point, a senior general, displeased, threatened to replace Adams with someone else, and even to have her court-martialed. Adams stood her ground so firmly and was so clearly in the right that it was the general who backed down. She understood something powerful, that doing the job brilliantly was itself a form of resistance, and that every letter her women delivered was proof, stacked one on top of another, that the people who doubted them had been wrong all along. The job the Army had allotted 6 months to complete, the 688 finished in 3, half the time. They cleared the entire towering backlog in Birmingham, reconnecting millions of soldiers with the families who had been trying to reach them. And they were so effective that they were not sent home. Instead, they were shipped across the Channel to France, first to the city of Rouen, and later to Paris, where more mountains of backlogged mail were waiting, some of it 3 years old. And in each place, the women of the 688 did the same thing. They took an impossible mess, and they cleared it faster than anyone expected. Think about what that actually meant. Multiplied by millions. A mother who finally learned her son was alive. A soldier who at last received the letter telling him he had become a father. A wife who heard from her husband for the first time in a year. The women of the 688 were not carrying rifles, but they were carrying hope, letter by letter, to a whole army that had been starving for it. In the summer of 1945, 3 members of the battalion, Mary Bankston, Mary Barlow, and Dolores Brown, were killed in a vehicle accident while serving in France. And here the Army revealed its indifference one more time. It would not pay for the funerals of these 3 women who had died in its service. So the women of the 688 took up a collection among themselves and paid to bury their own sisters. The 3 were laid to rest in the American Military Cemetery in Normandy, among the fallen of D-Day. Even in death, these women were cared for by their own, because the country they served would not do it. They had done the impossible. They had beaten the mountain of mail, beaten the doubters, and endured every insult their own army threw at them. Surely now they would come home to gratitude. And here is the part of their story that is hardest to accept. When the war ended and the 688 sailed back to the United States, there was nothing waiting for them. No parade, no ceremony, no official word of thanks. The battalion was quietly disbanded at a base in New Jersey in early 1946, and the women simply went home. Back to a country still segregated, still ready to treat them as second class, as though they had never crossed an ocean, never cleared those warehouses, never carried hope to millions of soldiers at all. And so, their story was forgotten. For decades, almost no one knew what the 688 had done. The women grew older. They raised families and lived quiet lives, and many of them rarely spoke of the extraordinary thing they had been part of, because no one had ever told them it mattered. The greatest mail-sorting achievement of the war, accomplished under the harshest conditions, by women fighting racism and sexism at the same time, faded almost completely from memory. Decades later, a determined effort began to make sure these women were finally remembered. In the year 2018, a monument to the 688 was dedicated at a park in Kansas, carved with the names of all 855 women. And in 2022, more than 75 years after they cleared those warehouses, the United States awarded the women of the 688 the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest honor the Congress can bestow. But by then, time had done what the Army's neglect had started. Almost all of the women were gone. Only a small handful lived to see their nation finally say the words. One of the last of them, a woman named Lena Derricott King, lived to the age of 100, long enough to see her battalion begin to receive the recognition it had earned a lifetime before. Most of her sisters never got that chance. The women of the 688 fought a war on two fronts, against a mountain of undelivered mail, and against a country that doubted them at every turn, and they won on both. They reconnected a broken army with everyone it loved back home, and in doing so they proved 17 million times over that the people who had bet on their failure were wrong. They asked for nothing but the chance to serve, and they were given the hardest job in the theater and the least respect to do it with. They earned their honor in 1945. It just took their country the better part of a century to admit it. The least we can do now is say their names and remember that when the mail stopped and morale was breaking, it was these women who carried hope across an ocean, one letter at a time. If you believe these women deserve to be remembered, subscribe and stay with this channel. There are more of these stories than you could ever imagine, and almost no one is telling them.